Welcome, dear friends. And do come in, won't you? Pull up a chair, settle yourself comfortably, and perhaps pour a cup of something warm, because the story I have for you today is not the kind you rush through. No. This one deserves your full attention. We are going to a village, a quiet English village, the kind with a Norman church, a post office that smells of old paper, and a manor house that has stood on the hill since before anyone can properly remember. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where curtains move when a stranger walks past, and where secrets have a way of staying buried, until, that is, a painting gets damaged. Not just any painting. A portrait, grand, old, formal, hanging in the great hall of Chipping Haverley Manor. And when the damage is assessed, something extraordinary is found beneath the surface. Another face, hidden deliberately, painted over with careful hands, and left there in the dark for decades. A face that someone in this village very much did not want found. And when the restorer who discovered it turns up dead, well, that changes everything, doesn't it? This is a story about art and identity, and the very dangerous business of keeping secrets. It is set in the English countryside, sometime in the early 1950s, and it moves the way those years moved, slowly, deliberately, with a great deal of tea and a great deal of observation. And at the center of it all, watching, listening, knitting quietly in the corner, is Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead. She is not as young as she once was. Her knees trouble her on damp mornings. She occasionally loses her train of thought mid-sentence and has to find it again. But her eyes, those pale, steady, rather unsettling eyes, miss very little indeed. So do stay with us, friends. The portrait has two faces, and before we are done, you will know them both. The damaged canvas. The trouble began, as trouble so often does in English villages, with something perfectly ordinary. It was a Wednesday, grey and close, the kind of October morning that cannot quite decide whether to rain or simply threaten it indefinitely. Mrs. Fellows, who cleaned the great hall at Chipping Haverley Manor every fortnight without fail, had arrived at 8:30 with her usual basket of cloths and polish, her usual expression of mild dissatisfaction, and her usual intention of being done by noon. She was not done by noon. At approximately 9:15, whilst reaching up with a long-handled duster to address the upper corner of the east wall, she caught the frame of the large portrait that hung there, the one depicting the 3rd Baron Haverley in his hunting clothes, looking stern and faintly ridiculous in equal measure, and brought the whole thing sideways off its hook with a crash that sent 2 ceramic dogs off the mantelpiece and brought Mr. Granville, the manor's aging butler, running from the corridor at a pace his ankles had not been asked to manage in some years. The painting was not destroyed, but it was damaged. The lower right corner had struck the iron fender of the fireplace, and a section of canvas roughly the size of a man's hand had cracked and partially separated from the layer beneath. And it was in that separated section, in that small, accidental wound in the surface of the painting, that something was first seen. Mr. Granville sent word to Sir Edmund Haverley, the present occupant of the manor, who was in London on business and returned the following afternoon in a state of moderate irritation. Sir Edmund was 53, a widower, and a man who regarded the manor largely as an obligation rather than a pleasure. He had inherited it from a distant cousin 11 years ago, along with the debts, the drafts, and the general inconvenience of a house built for a larger and more ceremonial age. He stood in the great hall and looked at the damaged portrait for a long moment. "Well," he said finally, "it will have to be restored." Mr. Granville, who had been standing at a respectful distance with his hands behind his back, cleared his throat. "There is also, Sir Edmund, the matter of what appears beneath the damage." Sir Edmund looked again. He stepped closer. He put on his glasses, which he kept in his breast pocket and used only when strictly necessary, as he considered them a concession to age that he had not yet fully accepted. He looked for rather a long time. Beneath the cracked surface layer, beneath the oils that depicted the hunting coat and the background drapery of the 3rd Baron Haverley's left hip and lower torso, there was another painting, another layer entirely, and in the small exposed section, one could make out what appeared to be a hand, a woman's hand, rendered with considerably more delicacy than the hunting portrait above it. And beside the hand, the edge of something, a piece of correspondence perhaps, or a document, held between painted fingers with an air that suggested significance. "Good Lord," said Sir Edmund. "Quite," said Mr. Granville. The restorer arrived 4 days later. His name was Mr. Philip Rudd, and he came from a firm in Oxford that specialised in the conservation of old paintings. He was 38, slight, and wore a brown corduroy jacket that had seen better decades. He carried his equipment in a battered leather case and spoke about paint layers with the quiet enthusiasm of a man who has found his precise subject in life and intends to remain there. Miss Marple, who happened to be staying with her old friend Mrs. Atwood in the village at the time, she had been persuaded to come for a fortnight's rest, her niece having expressed some concern about her colour, heard about the discovery from Mrs. Atwood's daily, who had heard it from the butcher, who had it directly from Mr. Granville's sister-in-law. "A hidden painting," said Miss Marple, setting down her teacup with an expression of mild but genuine interest. "How very curious." "Isn't it?" said Mrs. Atwood, who was more interested in whether the rain would hold off long enough for her to get her washing in. "Though I expect it's nothing. These old houses are always full of that sort of thing." Said Miss Marple, in the tone she used when she was thinking something quite different from what she was saying. She picked up her knitting again. Outside the window, the October rain had made up its mind at last and was coming down steadily on the village green. She met Philip Rudd quite by accident 3 days after his arrival at the small post office on the high street. He was sending a parcel, samples, he explained, for preliminary analysis, and she was collecting a letter from her nephew Raymond, who wrote regularly and at length about his own affairs with the cheerful assumption that she found them as fascinating as he did. They fell into conversation in the way that people do in village post offices, where the queue moves slowly and silence feels impolite. "You are the gentleman from Oxford," she said, "working at the manor." He seemed mildly surprised that she knew, then remembered where he was. "That's right, Philip Rudd, conservation work." "And how is it progressing?" He hesitated, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, before answering. "Early days still. These things take time. One has to be quite methodical." "I imagine so," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "And the hidden painting, is it very extensive, beneath the other one?" He looked at her with rather more attention than he had been giving her previously. Yes, more than I initially thought, actually." "How interesting," she said. And then the queue moved forward, and the moment passed, and they went their separate ways with the usual pleasantries. But Miss Marple walked home slowly, despite the damp, and thought about the way his voice had changed on that last sentence. Not excitement, exactly. Something more guarded than excitement. Something, she thought, rather more like unease. The village of Chipping Haverley was not a large place. It had the church, the post office, the public house, the crossed quays, which had been there since 1780 and smelled as though it remembered, a small school, a doctor's surgery, and perhaps 40 houses of varying sizes arranged along 3 streets and a lane. It was the sort of village that appeared peaceful, and probably was on the surface, most of the time. But Miss Marple had lived long enough in St. Mary Mead to know that village surfaces were precisely that, surfaces. What lay beneath them was another matter entirely. She had been there a week when she began to notice things, small things at first. The way conversation in the crossed quays shifted when a certain name was mentioned, a Mr. Harold Tice, who was the village's most prominent solicitor and sat on every local committee of any importance. Not that anyone said anything improper. It was more the way people didn't say things, a particular quality of careful neutrality that Miss Marple recognized, because she had seen it before. She had seen it in St. Mary Mead, years ago, when it turned out that the chairman of the parish council had been quietly extracting money from the church restoration fund for 11 years. And everyone had known, in that way that villages know things without ever quite admitting it. Everyone had been carefully, collectively neutral on the subject of Mr. Partridge until the day he wasn't there to be neutral about anymore. It was the same quality. She was almost certain of it. She said nothing about this to Mrs. Atwood, who was a kind woman but not discreet. She said nothing to anyone. She simply knitted and listened and walked slowly through the village on fine mornings and paid attention. It was on a Thursday, 10 days after her arrival, that she passed the manor gates on her afternoon walk and encountered Mr. Rudd coming out of them in some haste. He nearly walked into her, checked himself, apologized, and then stood for a moment in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely sure where he was going. He looked, she thought, rather pale. "Are you quite all right, Mr. Rudd?" she asked. Yes, perfectly." He passed a hand across his forehead. "Just a long day. The work is more complicated than I anticipated." "In what way complicated?" He looked at her, then he looked at the road, then he looked at her again, and she had the impression of a man making a decision. "The portrait beneath," he said quietly. "I know who it is now, or rather, I'm fairly certain." "And that is troubling you?" It wasn't a question. He seemed to register that. "It's a delicate situation," he said carefully. "There are people in this village who would find the subject sensitive." Miss Marple waited. She had found, over many years, that waiting was often more productive than asking. But whatever Mr. Rudd had been about to say next, he thought better of it. He straightened, adjusted the strap of his leather case on his shoulder, and gave her a brief, polite smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Do mind the lane. It's quite muddy past the gate." And he went off down the road, walking quickly, his shoulders slightly hunched against the October chill. Miss Marple watched him go. Sensitive, she thought. Yes, I rather think it is. She turned and walked slowly back toward Mrs. Atwood's cottage, her knitting bag over her arm, the first cold drops of what would become a serious evening rain beginning to fall around her. She did not hurry, but she was thinking, quite hard, every step of the way. The dead restorer. The body was found on a Friday morning. It was Mrs. Fellows who found it. Mrs. Fellows, who had started the whole business with her duster and her unfortunate reach, and who would later remark to anyone willing to listen that she had known from the very beginning that painting meant trouble. She had come to do the East Corridor, which was not on her usual fortnight rotation, but which Mr. Granville had specifically requested on account of a visiting relative expected at the weekend. She let herself in through the side entrance at 8 o'clock, as was her custom, and made her way toward the great hall to collect the cleaning trolley. She found Philip Rudd on the floor in front of the portrait. He was lying on his back, his leather case open beside him, his tools arranged with a neatness that seemed at odds with the violence that had clearly been done to him. He had been struck, the doctor would confirm this later, with something heavy and smooth, a single blow to the back of the head, delivered from behind. He would not have seen it coming. He would not have suffered long. Mrs. Fellows did not scream. She was a practical woman. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then walked to the telephone in the corridor and rang the police. Inspector Hale arrived from the county station by 9:30. He was a solid, careful man in his middle 40s, with a methodical manner and the slightly weary expression of someone who has investigated enough rural unpleasantness to have lost any lingering romantic notions about the English countryside. He secured the great hall, spoke to Mr. Granville, spoke to Mrs. Fellows, and sent for Sir Edmund, who was fortunately at home this time, and came down from his study in his dressing gown looking shaken. The village knew by 11. In Chipping Haverley, news of this magnitude did not require a newspaper. It moved through the high street and into the post office and across the green and into every kitchen and sitting room by means of the informal but highly efficient network that small villages have maintained since time immemorial. By lunchtime, there was not a soul in the village who did not know that the restorer from Oxford had been found dead in the manor's great hall, and that the police were there, and that it was not an accident. Miss Marple heard it from Mrs. Atwood's daily at 10:30. While she was sitting by the window with her knitting and the dregs of her morning tea, she sat quietly for a moment after the girl had gone back to the kitchen. Then she said, to no one in particular, "Oh, the poor young man." She set her knitting in her lap and looked out at the village green, where the October light was doing its best against a flat grey sky. She thought about a hand seen through a crack in old paint. She thought about the word sensitive, spoken on a cold lane by a man who was now dead. She thought about the particular quality of silence that had surrounded the name Harold Tice in the public house. She picked up her knitting again, but she did not knit. She simply held it and thought for quite a long while. She called on Inspector Hale that afternoon. This required a certain amount of management. Team Inspector Hale was perfectly civil. He was always perfectly civil. But he had the standard professional's instinctive resistance to civilian involvement. And he was, moreover, the sort of man who found elderly ladies with knitting bags faintly difficult to take seriously. Miss Marple was well acquainted with this response. She had encountered it many times. She had long since stopped finding it annoying and had begun, in a quiet way, to find it rather useful. She presented herself at the manor gates at 2:00, explained to the constable on duty that she had spoken with Mr. Rudd only the previous day and might have information relevant to the inquiry, and was admitted after a short wait. Inspector Hale received her in the library, a book-lined room that smelled of dust and old leather, with the expression of a man who is being conscientious. "Miss Marple, you spoke with the deceased yesterday afternoon, you said." "Yes, briefly, on the lane outside the gates as he was leaving." She settled herself in the chair he indicated and placed her knitting bag on her lap. "He seemed troubled about something. He mentioned that the portrait, the hidden one beneath the damaged surface, that the subject of it was someone whose identity would be sensitive. Those were his words, sensitive." "Did he say who?" "No, he stopped himself. I had the impression he had almost said more than he intended." Inspector Hale made a note. "And the time of this conversation?" "Approximately 3:30, perhaps 4:45. And he seemed, physically, well, not threatened, not frightened." Miss Marple considered this with the care it deserved. "Uneasy," she said finally. "Not frightened precisely, more as though he was carrying something uncomfortable and wasn't certain what to do with it." The inspector nodded slowly. "We found his notes," he said, in the tone of a man offering information he has not entirely decided to offer. In his case, he kept detailed records of his work, dates, observations, technical notes. The last entry was made yesterday evening, around 7:00 by the look of it. And," he paused, "the final line reads, 'Identity confirmed. Must consider carefully before proceeding.' This changes the nature of the commission considerably." Miss Marple absorbed this. "I see," she said quietly. "Does that mean something to you, Miss Marple?" "It suggests," she said carefully, "that he had moved from suspicion to certainty. Between our conversation at 3:30 and 7:00, something confirmed what he suspected." She paused. "Did he make any telephone calls during that time?" The inspector looked at her with slightly more attention than before. "We're looking into that." "The portrait," she said. "The hidden one. What has become of it? Has more been uncovered?" "We've left everything as it was for now. The scene is preserved." He stood, indicating that the interview was drawing to a close. "I appreciate you coming in, Miss Marple. If you think of anything else—" "Of course." She rose, unhurried, and collected her bag. At the door she paused in the way she sometimes did, as though something had just occurred to her. "Inspector, the blow. From behind, I understand." He stiffened slightly. "Or where did you hear that?" "Mrs. Fellows is a neighbour of Mrs. Atwood's sister," she said simply. "Small village." A brief, involuntary expression crossed his face that might, in a more relaxed man, have been a smile. "Yes, from behind, single blow." "So he knew the person," she said, "or at least he did not feel threatened by their presence. He turned his back on them." She nodded pleasantly. "Good afternoon, Inspector." She did not go directly back to Mrs. Atwood's. Instead, she walked, rather slowly, through the village, past the post office, where a small knot of women were talking in lowered voices on the step, past the crossed quays, where she could see through the window that the bar was occupied despite the early hour, past the surgery where Dr. Pemberton's car was absent. He would be at the manor, she supposed. She stopped at the small newsagent's and bought a packet of peppermints she didn't particularly want. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Slade, who knew everything about everyone and was constitutionally incapable of keeping any of it to herself, was vibrating with the suppressed energy of someone who has significant news and insufficient audience. Miss Marple provided the audience. "Terrible business," she said, unwrapping a peppermint. "Terrible," agreed Mrs. Slade, leaning forward. "And you know what they're saying, don't you? They're saying it wasn't random. They're saying he'd found something in that painting, something someone didn't want found." "People do say these things," said Miss Marple mildly. "Well, but—" Mrs. Slade lowered her voice to the register she used for serious intelligence. "He was seen, Miss Marple, yesterday evening, around 6 o'clock, going into Harold Tice's office on the High Street. Clear as anything. My sister-in-law saw him through the window. She was passing on her way to the chemist." Miss Marple unwrapped another peppermint with great deliberateness. "Mr. Tice, the solicitor." "The very same." Mrs. Slade's eyebrows performed a significant movement. "Now what would a painting restorer want with a solicitor at 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening? After hours, mind you. The office was supposed to be closed." Miss Marple considered the peppermints in her hand for a moment. Identity confirmed. Must consider carefully before proceeding. A visit to a solicitor. After hours. On the evening he died. "How very interesting," she said pleasantly, and bought a second packet of peppermints she didn't want either, and walked home through the cold afternoon air, thinking all the way. Whispers in the village. The village did what villages always do in the aftermath of violent death. It talked. Not openly. That would have been considered poor form, and Chipping Haverley prided itself, as most English villages do, on a certain standard of decorum. But in the spaces between decorum, in the queue at the post office, in the pews before Sunday service properly began, in the careful pauses of conversation over garden fences, the talk moved constantly, like water finding its level. Miss Marple listened to all of it. She had developed, over many decades, a particular technique for this. It did not involve asking questions, which put people on their guard. It involved being present, quietly, unremarkably, comfortably present, in the places where talk happened, with her knitting and her mild expression and her apparently wandering attention. People spoke quite freely around a small elderly lady who appeared to be counting stitches. She was rarely counting stitches. The first thread came from the crossed keys on Saturday evening. Mrs. Atwood had gone to bed early with a headache, and Miss Marple, who was not in the least sleepy, had put on her coat and walked the short distance to the public house on the reasonable grounds that a small glass of something warm would help her sleep, and that fresh air, even cold October air, was improving. The crossed keys was moderately busy. A Friday murder had done nothing to diminish custom, and had in fact increased it, since people who wished to discuss things found it easier to do so away from their own sitting rooms. She settled herself in the corner with a small port and her knitting, and she listened. The name that kept surfacing, carefully, with that particular quality of careful neutrality she had noticed before, was Harold Tice. Not accusations, nothing so direct. It was more the shape of things left unsaid. A man at the bar saying, "Well, Tice will know what to do with it, he always does," and the slight, uncomfortable laugh that followed. A woman near the fire remarking that some people in this village have done very well for themselves, with an emphasis on some that carried considerable freight. An older farmer, well into his second pint, saying to his companion in a lowered voice that he'd always thought it would come out eventually, one way or another, and his companion shushing him with an urgency that suggested he agreed, but felt the public house was not the place. Come out. The phrasing interested her. Not something would happen, not it would catch up with him, but it would come out, as though there was a specific it, a known quantity, a secret with a shape. The second thread came from an unexpected source. On Sunday morning, after church, she had attended the 11 o'clock service, which was lightly attended and conducted by a vicar who read his sermon from notes with the air of a man who had written it in some haste. She was approached in the churchyard by a woman she had not yet met. She was perhaps 60, well dressed in a dated way, with the upright posture of someone who has been taught to stand correctly and has never stopped. Her name, she said, was Miss Cartwright, Agnes Cartwright, and she had heard that Miss Marple was a friend of Mrs. Atwood's. "I hope you will forgive me for introducing myself without a proper introduction," she said, in a voice that had clearly been trained out of a regional accent some decades ago. "I find the circumstances somewhat override the usual formalities." "Of course," said Miss Marple warmly. "Do walk with me a little. The cold is rather fierce when one stands still." They walked along the churchyard path, between the old stones, at the slow pace that the terrain and their respective ages suggested. Miss Cartwright was quiet for a moment, arranging what she wanted to say. "I knew Philip Rudd," she said finally. "Not well, but I had met him some years ago at an exhibition in Oxford. We had corresponded occasionally since. About art. He was very knowledgeable." She paused. "He wrote to me last week, a letter. It arrived on Saturday after the news." Miss Marple waited. "He wrote that he had made a discovery in the painting that he found disturbing. He did not say what, precisely, but he said—" She hesitated, then continued. "He said that it concerned someone who had done considerable harm in this village, and that he was uncertain whether his duty lay with his client, Sir Edmund, or with something larger." She stopped walking. "He used the word harm quite deliberately, Miss Marple. Not embarrassment, not inconvenience, harm." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "I see the distinction. I have given the letter to the police, to Inspector Hale this morning, but I wanted—" She stopped again. "I have lived in this village for 30 years. In Miss Marple, I know what is said and what is not said about certain people, and I know that the police are very thorough and very competent, but they do not always understand how a village works, the particular way in which silence is maintained," said Miss Marple. Agnes Cartwright looked at her with something that might have been relief. "Yes, precisely that." They stood for a moment among the old stones in the cold churchyard. A crow settled briefly on a nearby grave, and then thought better of it, and left. "May I ask," said Miss Marple, "how long you have noticed this silence, around Mr. Tice?" Agnes Cartwright did not look surprised at the name. 8 years, she said. Perhaps 9. I noticed it beginning, around the time that Colonel Barrow sold the mill property for rather less than it was worth, and moved away quite suddenly. And then the Hendersons, and then Dr. Pemberton's partnership difficulty. Though he stayed. She paused. There were always explanations. There are always explanations for these things in villages. Business reversals, family troubles, decisions made for reasons that are nobody else's business. One doesn't like to speculate. "But," said Miss Marple, "but when you see the same pattern repeat itself, with the same man always slightly adjacent to the misfortune, always slightly present at the edge of each story," she pressed her lips together. "One notices. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, she said. One does. The third thread, the one that pulled the others into shape, came on Monday afternoon. She had gone to the manor, not to see the inspector, who she knew would be occupied, but to see Mrs. Fellows, who lived in one of the estate cottages and whom she had visited twice before, on the social pretext of inquiring after the shock of Friday morning. Mrs. Fellows was a sensible woman who appreciated being treated as such, and she and Miss Marple had achieved, over 2 cups of strong tea, a comfortable mutual understanding. Today, Mrs. Fellows had something on her mind. I didn't tell the police, she said, pouring the tea with a slight air of confession. I didn't think it was my place, or I thought, perhaps it was nothing. What was it? Asked Miss Marple, accepting her cup. 3 weeks ago. Before all this started, before the painting was damaged even. She settled herself. I was cleaning the upper corridor, the one above the Great Hall, on a Tuesday morning, and I heard voices below, through the floor. The boards are thin up there, always have been. I wasn't listening, not deliberately, but voices carry. Whose voices? Mr. Tice. I recognized him. I've heard him speak enough times at the village meetings. And Sir Edmund. She paused. They were arguing, not loudly, not shouting, but the kind of arguing that's kept quiet on purpose, the kind that's worse than shouting. She looked at her tea. I heard Mr. Tice say, quite clearly, it has been managed for 20 years and it will continue to be managed. And Sir Edmund said something I couldn't quite catch. And then Mr. Tice said, and this I heard very clearly because his voice went harder. You have benefited considerably from this arrangement, Edmund, and you will remember that before you do anything foolish. The kitchen was very quiet. You have benefited considerably from this arrangement, repeated Miss Marple softly. Yes, Mrs. Fellows set down her cup. And then Sir Edmund said, quite low, I didn't know what it was, in the beginning, and Mr. Tice said, that is no longer relevant. Miss Marple sat with this for a moment. Outside the cottage window, the afternoon light was already failing, as October light does, quickly, without warning, as though it has simply lost interest. It has been managed for 20 years. 20 years. And a portrait painted over, hidden beneath another, hung in a great hall where no one would think to look. Mrs. Fellows, she said carefully. You said this was 3 weeks ago, before the painting was damaged. The Tuesday before, yes. And the painting was damaged the following Wednesday. That's right. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Then she said, did anyone else know that Mrs. Fellows would be cleaning the Great Hall that Wednesday? That she would use the long-handled duster? Mrs. Fellows blinked. Well, it's a regular schedule. Mr. Granville keeps the calendar. Anyone in the house would know. Yes, said Miss Marple. Yes, I thought so. She finished her tea and declined a second cup, though she was offered one, and walked back to Mrs. Atwood's in the early dark, very slowly, turning things over in her mind with great care. The painting had not been damaged by accident. She was almost entirely certain of it now. For the accident had been arranged, not the crack itself, perhaps, that was too precise, but the conditions. Mrs. Fellows and her long duster. The painting hung slightly too high, the frame not properly secured. Small things, carefully set. Not to damage the painting seriously. Whoever arranged it would not have wanted serious damage, would not have wanted a restorer brought in at all. It was meant, she thought, to prompt a move of the painting, a repair that could be done quietly, privately, by someone trusted. What had not been anticipated was the crack, the accidental exposure, the glimpse of what lay beneath. And then Mr. Rudd had been brought in, and had seen, and had understood, and had gone to Harold Tice's office on a Thursday evening, and had not come home. The second face. She did not sleep well on Monday night. This was not unusual. Miss Marple had not slept particularly well since approximately 1947, and had made a kind of peace with it. She lay in Mrs. Atwood's spare bedroom, which smelled pleasantly of lavender and old wood, and listened to the house settle around her, and thought about paintings. She thought about the deliberate act of painting over something, the patience it required, the intention behind it. You did not cover a portrait carelessly. It was not the work of an afternoon. It required preparation, the correct materials, a steady hand, and a very clear idea of what you were doing and why. Someone had stood before that canvas 20 years ago or more and painted a life out of existence, not destroyed it. That was the thing that kept returning to her. And they had not destroyed it, they had hidden it. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. Destruction was final, decisive, the act of someone who wanted a thing gone entirely. Hiding was something else. Hiding suggested ambivalence. Or perhaps, she turned this over carefully, it suggested that the original painting had value, that it could not simply be discarded, that keeping it, even hidden, even inaccessible, was important for some reason she had not yet understood. She got up at 5:30, put on her dressing gown, and sat by the window with a cold cup of tea until the grey October dawn began, very reluctantly, to arrive. She had asked and been refused. Inspector Hale on Tuesday morning had been perfectly polite and absolutely firm. The great hall was still a preserved scene. He could not allow a civilian to view the portrait or the uncovered section beneath it, and he was sure she understood. She did understand. She also knew from long experience that there was usually more than one way to see a thing. She found it in the form of Mr. Granville. The butler was 71 years old and had been at the manor for 43 years. He was, Miss Marple had observed, a man of deep professional loyalty to the house itself, not to Sir Edmund particularly, but to the manor as an institution, as a continuity. He had served 3 occupants and would, she suspected, have served a 4th with equal dedication. This was the kind of loyalty that was not personal, but almost architectural, built into him the way the manor's oak beams were built into its walls. She called on him at the estate cottage he occupied near the rear of the grounds on Tuesday afternoon, with a tin of shortbread from the village shop and the straightforward explanation that she wished to speak with him about something that concerned the welfare of the house. He let her in. His sitting room was tidy in the way that the rooms of people who have spent their lives in service are tidy. Everything in its place, nothing excessive, a quality of order that was habitual rather than anxious. He made tea without asking whether she wanted it, which she respected. "You have been here a long time, Mr. Granville," she said. 43 years, he said, since the previous occupant, Sir Edmund's cousin, and the portrait, the hunting portrait. How long has it hung in the Great Hall? He considered. Since before my time. It was there when I arrived, the 3rd Baron. He was Sir Edmund's cousin's grandfather or thereabouts. Old family. And has it always hung in exactly that position, on the east wall? Something shifted very slightly in his expression. It was moved, he said, after a pause. Some years ago, I moved it myself, on instruction. Whose instruction? A longer pause. He looked at his tea. Mr. Tice was involved in the estate management at the time, various administrative matters. He had authority in certain things. Mr. Tice asked you to move the portrait to the east wall. He suggested it. Sir Edmund's cousin, the previous occupant, was unwell by then, not fully, not in complete charge of things. He stopped. Mr. Tice managed a great many things in that period. And when was this? 1931, he said. Or 32. I would have to look at my records to be precise. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Mr. Granville, the hidden portrait. You have seen the uncovered section. It was not a question. He had been in that hall when Sir Edmund examined the damage. He had stood at a respectful distance, but he had eyes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "It is a woman's hand, holding a document. Yes, do you know the portrait? Have you seen it before? The original, before it was painted over?" The silence this time was longer, long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said very quietly, "There was a portrait in the upstairs sitting room when I first came. A woman, a local woman, not a family member. It was considered unusual for her portrait to hang in the manor. There were questions about it at the time. About why it was there, about the nature of the connection." He paused. "It disappeared. I was told it had been sold. But..." He stopped again. "But you didn't believe it," said Miss Marple gently. "I didn't ask," he said. "That is not the same thing." She went to the library that afternoon. The village had a small public library, 2 rooms above the post office, maintained by a voluntary committee and open on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. The librarian was a Mr. Peel, retired schoolteacher, who knew the local history collection with the thoroughness of a man who has spent many quiet afternoons with it. Miss Marple told him she was interested in the history of Chipping Haverley and the manor, and he was delighted. People were rarely interested in the local history collection. She spent 2 hours with old parish records, a local newspaper archives bundled in faded cardboard, and 2 privately printed histories of the area that had been donated by their authors and read, judging by their condition, by almost no one else. She found what she was looking for in a bundle of newspaper cuttings from 1931 and 1932. A notice, first, a small one, the kind that appears in the announcements column without fanfare. Miss Eleanor Voss, formerly of Haverley Mill Cottage, has departed the village. No explanation, no forwarding address. The kind of notice that in 1931 meant exactly what it didn't say. And then, 6 months later, a longer piece, a report on a property sale. Haverley Mill, a substantial property on the edge of the village, sold at a price that the reporter noted was considerably below market value. The buyer, a development concern. The seller, acting through his solicitor. The estate of the late Mr. George Voss, deceased. The solicitor named Harold Tice. She sat back in her chair and looked at the water-stained ceiling of the library's upper room and thought for a long moment. Eleanor Voss, departed 1931, her father dead, his property sold at undervalue through Harold Tice, and somewhere in the manor, hidden beneath 20 years of paint, a portrait of a woman holding a document. Not a love portrait. She was increasingly certain of that. The hand in the exposed section was not posed sentimentally. Even in the small glimpse available, there was something in the angle of it, the deliberateness of how the document was held, that spoke of meaning rather than decoration. A document, held deliberately, painted into a record. She thought about what kind of woman, in 1931, what would have herself painted, holding a document, and why. She found the answer, or the shape of the answer, in the second privately printed history. It was a slim volume, self-published in 1948, by a local solicitor named Graves, who had since died, and it concerned itself with property law and land transactions in the Haverley area between 1900 and 1940. It was, objectively, extremely dull reading. Miss Marple read it with complete attention. There was a chapter on the mill properties, and in that chapter, a footnote, the kind of footnote that is added by a careful man who wants the record to exist somewhere, even if he cannot say the thing plainly in the text. The footnote read, "It should be noted that questions were raised at the time regarding the circumstances of certain property transactions in the early 1930s, particularly those involving the Voss estate and 2 other local properties. These questions were not formally pursued. Documents pertaining to these matters were understood to be in private hands. Documents pertaining to these matters were understood to be in private hands. A woman holding a document, painted into a canvas, hidden for 20 years. Miss Marple closed the book. Eleanor Voss had had evidence of improper property transactions, fraud very likely, or something adjacent to it. And Harold Tice had known she had it. And instead of allowing it to be destroyed, She had done something rather clever and rather brave for a woman alone in 1931. She had had herself painted with it, had placed the record where it could be found, if someone knew to look, in a house where Tice could not easily reach. Except that he had reached it eventually. Not to destroy the portrait. Too risky, too noticed, but to hide it, to paint over it, to hang another portrait on top of it in a house whose occupant was elderly and unwell and managed, in various administrative matters, by Harold Tice himself. And it had stayed hidden for 20 years, until a duster caught a frame. She was back at Mrs. Atwood's by 5 o'clock, and she sat in the sitting room with her knitting. Actually knitting this time, finding the rhythm of it helpful for thinking, and assembled what she had. Harold Tice had been operating something in this village for the better part of 20 years. Property fraud, at the foundation of it, the Voss estate, the mill sale, likely others. But property fraud, she thought, was probably only the beginning. A man who began with that, and found it undetected, and found that he had the means, the legal knowledge, the position, the access to private information that a solicitor inevitably acquires, would not stop there. It has been managed for 20 years, and it will continue to be managed. Managed, the word of a man running something, an operation, not one crime, but a continuing arrangement. The people Agnes Cartwright had mentioned, Colonel Barrow, the Hendersons, Dr. Pemberton, each one adjacent to some unexplained misfortune, each one with Harold Tice slightly present at the edge of the story, men and women who had, perhaps, inconvenient knowledge, or inconvenient situations that Tice knew about, or property that he wanted, a blackmail ring. She let the word settle in her mind properly for the first time, though she had been circling it for days. Not random opportunism, organized, sustained, built on a solicitor's unique access to people's most private troubles and secrets, and on 20 years of successful concealment. And Eleanor Voss had known. In 1931, she had known, and she had had evidence, and she had been removed from the village. How, Miss Marple did not yet know. There were ways of removing a woman in 1931 that did not require anything so obvious as violence, and her evidence had been, it was thought, dealt with. Only it hadn't been. It had been here all along, waiting. Philip Rudd had uncovered it, had understood it, had gone to Harold Tice's office. Why? To confront him? To give him the opportunity to explain? He had been a decent young man, she thought, with an uncertain idea of where his duty lay. He had used the word consider in his notes. He had been thinking, I'm not acting, and someone had not given him the time to finish thinking. She dropped a stitch and didn't notice for nearly a full row. There was one more thing she needed to know. She needed to know what the document in the portrait actually was. Its nature. What kind of evidence, specifically? Because that would determine what Harold Tice stood to lose, and how much, and whether what he had done to Philip Rudd was the action of a man protecting an old fraud, or something considerably worse. She thought about who might know, and then she thought about Dr. Pemberton. Agnes Cartwright had mentioned him separately from the others. He had stayed where the others had left. His partnership difficulty, she had said it with a particular delicacy that suggested the difficulty had been of a personal rather than professional nature. A doctor. Who had stayed? Who had, perhaps, been given reason to stay? Who might know from his own experience of Harold Tice's methods a great deal more than he had ever told anyone? She would call on Dr. Pemberton in the morning. She picked up the dropped stitch, which had run further than she'd expected, and spent a few minutes repairing it, and thought that some things, when they unraveled, went back further than you imagined, and that repairing them required patience and the right tools, and a willingness to go back to the very beginning of the problem. She rang Inspector Hale that evening. She did not tell him everything. She had learned over many years that telling policemen everything at once produced one of two responses. Either they dismissed it, or they acted too quickly in the wrong direction before the picture was complete. What she told him was this, that she believed the hidden portrait depicted a local woman named Eleanor Voss who had left the village in 1931, and that there appeared to be a connection between the Voss estate, certain local property transactions of that period, and Harold Tice. Inspector Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Marple, I want you to be careful." "I am always careful," she said. "I mean it. If what you're suggesting is accurate, a man who has maintained something like this for 20 years is not someone who will—" "I know what he will do," she said quietly. "He has already done it." Another silence. "Stay away from Tice," said the inspector. "Please." "Of course," she said. She meant it, as far as it went. She had no intention of going near Harold Tice. It was Dr. Pemberton she was going to see. Threads and shadows. Dr. Pemberton lived in a stone house at the quieter end of the village, set back from the lane behind a garden that had gone somewhat wild since his wife's death 3 years ago. He was 64, a tall man who had shrunk slightly with age, with large hands and the careful, assessing eyes of someone who has spent 40 years looking at people and determining what was actually wrong with them, as opposed to what they said was wrong with them. He did not seem surprised to see her. That, in itself, told her something. "Miss Marple," he said, opening the door before she had finished raising her hand to knock. "I wondered when you'd come. Do come in. It's bitter out." His sitting room was comfortable in a neglected way. Good furniture, books everywhere. A fire that had been burning long enough to have opinions about itself. He did not offer tea, which she found interesting. A man who offers tea is managing a social situation. A man who doesn't is preparing to speak plainly. They sat. "You know why I'm here," she said. "I know why you're here," he agreed. He looked at his hands for a moment, those large, careful hands, and then at the fire. "I've been expecting someone to come for a very long time. I rather hoped it wouldn't be a policeman." "It isn't, not yet." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "Philip Rudd came to see me. Did you know that?" She hadn't. "When?" "Thursday afternoon, before he went to Tice." He paused. He'd found something in the portrait. He'd been working carefully. More of the underneath was visible than what Sir Edmund had seen initially. "He came to me because—" He stopped and started again. "Because the document in the portrait, the one the woman is holding, he could read part of it. It was a letter, and my name was on it." The fire settled. Outside, the wind moved through the garden's overgrown things. "Your name," said Miss Marple quietly. "A letter I wrote, in 1931. He said it flatly, the way people say things they have rehearsed saying for a long time and have never actually said. "I was young, 32. I had done something, professionally, that I should not have done. Nothing that harmed a patient, but something irregular. Tice knew about it. He had a way of knowing things. I never understood how, even now. He came to me and he explained very pleasantly, very reasonably, what he knew and what the consequences would be if it became known, and what he would require in return for his discretion." What did he require? Information at first. A doctor hears things, knows things. He wanted to know about certain patients, their financial situations, their vulnerabilities, their private difficulties. I refused initially. He paused. He was very patient. He waited. And then he showed me the letter again and He stopped. "I was a coward, Miss Marple. I have known it for 20 years. She said nothing. She did not offer comfort or absolution, which he had not asked for and which were not hers to give in any case. "Eleanor Voss," she said instead. "You knew her." "She was a patient. She came to me after Tice had moved against her father's estate. She had the documents, the evidence of what he'd done. She was going to the county authorities." He was very still. "Tice found out. I don't know how. Perhaps she told someone she shouldn't have. Perhaps he was very good at finding things out." He looked at the fire. He told me what he was going to do. He told me as a courtesy, I think, to demonstrate that he could. She was removed from the village. There were family members elsewhere. Pressure was applied. I don't know the details. Her evidence was supposed to go with her. But she had the portrait made first. I didn't know that. Not then. He looked up. When Rudd told me, when he described what he'd found, I understood immediately what she had done. She had been clever, far cleverer than any of us. A pause. She had given the document to the portrait painter, a man named Ashford. He's dead now, and he had incorporated it into the composition. The letter she's holding in the portrait, it's real, or a copy of it, painted in, made permanent. Miss Marple absorbed this, a woman in 1931, knowing she was being forced out, knowing her evidence would be taken or discredited, had found a way to leave the truth behind her, had embedded it in oil and pigment on a canvas, and hung it in the one place she knew it would be preserved. Because destroying a portrait hanging in a manor house required explanation, required authorization, required the kind of open action that a careful, quiet man like Harold Tice would not risk. So he had hidden it instead, and it had waited. "What did you tell Mr. Rudd?" she asked. "Everything. What I've told you." He looked very tired. He was a good young man. He sat in that chair and he listened, and at the end he said he thought the right thing was probably to go to Tice directly. Give him the opportunity to... He stopped. I told him not to. I told him to go to the police. He said he wanted to try the other way first. His voice was level, but his hands, she noticed, were pressed hard against his knees. I should have stopped him. I should have, I don't know, telephoned the police myself that evening. You couldn't have known. No. He didn't sound convinced. But I've spent 20 years not knowing things it would have been inconvenient to know. One develops a habit. The fire had died down. Neither of them moved to tend it. "The letter in the portrait," said Miss Marple. "Your letter. If the portrait is properly uncovered, if the full painting is revealed and examined, it will be readable," he said simply. "Rudd said the painting is in remarkable condition. Ashford was a fine painter. Whatever Tice painted over it with, it preserved the original rather than damaged it." She nodded slowly. She was thinking about Inspector Hale, and about how much she now had to give him, and about the shape of the thing as it finally stood complete before her. "Dr. Pemberton," she said, "will you speak to Inspector Hale?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I have been trying to find the courage to do so for approximately 20 years, Miss Marple. I think I can manage it now." "Good," she said simply. She rose, collecting her bag and her coat. At the door, she paused. "Eleanor Voss. Do you know what became of her?" He was quiet for a moment. "She married, moved north, Yorkshire, I believe. She died in 1943. The Blitz." He paused. "She never came back." Miss Marple stood at the door for a moment. She thought about a woman who had been clever and brave and had done the best she could with the options available to her in 1931, and who had died without knowing whether any of it had mattered. "Well," she said quietly, "it mattered." She went out into the cold. She rang Inspector Hale from the telephone box on the high street rather than from Mrs. Atwood's, partly for privacy, partly because the walk had given her time to organize what she wanted to say, and organization felt important now that things were moving quickly. She told him about Dr. Pemberton. She told him about the letter in the portrait. She told him about Eleanor Voss and the property transactions and the footnote in Mr. Graves's history. She told him about Mrs. Fellows and the overheard conversation in the Great Hall. She did not tell him about the dropped stitch. Some things were private. Hale listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, there was a brief silence. "Miss Marple," he said, "I want you to go back to Mrs. Atwood's and stay there this evening." "I had every intention of doing so. I am rather tired. I mean it. Tice will know by now that things are moving. He will have... A man like this doesn't simply wait." "No," she agreed. He doesn't. We'll bring him in tonight. I want to do this properly. With the portrait, with Pemberton's statement, with the property records. I don't want him to have grounds to... You will manage it perfectly well, she said. You are a thorough man, Inspector. It is one of your better qualities. A brief pause. Thank you, he said, with the slight uncertainty of someone not entirely sure they've been complimented. Good night, said Miss Marple, and rang off. She stood in the telephone box for a moment in the yellow light, the cold pressing against the glass around her. She was, as she had told the inspector, rather tired. Her knees ached. She had walked more today than was probably sensible, and there was a low, uncomfortable feeling that she had recognized it many times before, the feeling that came when you had done what you could, and the rest was in other hands, and the dead were still dead, and that could not be changed by any amount of thinking. Philip Rudd had sat in a chair in Dr. Pemberton's sitting room and decided that the right thing was to give a man the chance to explain himself. He had been decent, and it had killed him. She pushed open the telephone box door and walked out into the cold night. The high street was empty. The lights in the crossed quays were on, a warm yellow square in the dark. Somewhere a dog was barking, then stopped. She walked back to Mrs. Atwood's, slowly, her bag over her arm, her breath making small clouds in the night air. The truth behind the frame. Harold Tice was arrested at 7:15 on Wednesday morning. Miss Marple heard about it from Mrs. Atwood, who heard it from her daily, who had it from the constable's wife, who lived 3 doors down from the Tice residence on Church Lane, and had watched the police car from behind her bedroom curtain with the mixture of horror and satisfaction that such moments produce in people who have quietly suspected something for a very long time without ever quite admitting it to themselves. Miss Marple was sitting at the breakfast table when Mrs. Atwood came in with the news and the toast simultaneously. She received both with equal composure. "They've taken him," said Mrs. Atwood, sitting down heavily. "Harold Tice, in a police car, at 7 in the morning." She pressed her hand to her chest in the manner of someone experiencing vicarious drama. "I can hardly believe it." "Can't you?" said Miss Marple, which was not quite a question. Mrs. Atwood looked at her. "You don't seem surprised." "I am relieved," said Miss Marple carefully. "That is not the same thing." Inspector Hale came to Mrs. Atwood's at 11 o'clock. He sat in the small parlour with his hat on his knee, and the expression of a man who has been awake since before 5 and is running on determination and cold tea. He looked, Miss Marple thought, like someone who had a great deal to say and was deciding how much of it to say to her. She waited. "Tice has been charged," he said finally, "with the murder of Philip Rudd, and we are pursuing additional charges, fraud, extortion. It going back a considerable number of years. It will take time to establish the full extent. These things always do." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I imagine they do." "Pemberton gave his statement last night, voluntarily, fully." He paused. It is a significant statement. There are others we believe will come forward now. When a thing like this breaks open, people who have been silent for a long time find it somewhat easier to speak. "The weight of collective silence is considerable," said Miss Marple. "When it lifts all at once." Hale nodded slowly. "The portrait is being fully uncovered, properly, with a qualified conservator, a different one from London. It will take several days." He looked at his hat. "The document in the portrait, the letter, appears to be substantially legible. Rudd was right about the condition of the painting. Ashford was an excellent painter. Whatever he used has preserved rather than damaged." "Eleanor Voss chose well," said Miss Marple quietly. "She did." He was quiet for a moment. "She chose very well, for a woman with very few choices available to her." Outside, the October morning had produced, unexpectedly, a thin winter sunshine, the kind that gives light without warmth, but is welcome nonetheless. It lay across the parlour floor in pale rectangles and illuminated the dust that Mrs. Atwood's daily had not yet addressed. "Tice," said Miss Marple. "Did he say anything when he was taken?" "Very little. He is a solicitor. He knows precisely what to say and what not to say." A pause. "He said one thing, apparently, when the officer mentioned the portrait. He said, 'I should have burned it.'" Hale looked up. "Which rather confirms the whole of it, I suppose." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It rather does." She thought about a man standing before a canvas 20 years ago, brush in hand, making the choice not to burn, but to cover. The same ambivalence she had considered in the small hours of Monday morning. He had not been able to destroy it entirely, whether from caution or from some remnant of the thing that makes people preserve rather than erase, she could not say. And that failure of final resolution had been his undoing, in the end. "Sir Edmund," she said, "what will happen to him?" Hale's expression became careful. "That is more complicated. He benefited from certain arrangements, it appears, without fully understanding their nature initially. By the time he understood more, he paused, choosing words. He was sufficiently implicated that Tice was able to ensure his continued silence. He is cooperating fully now. He said, 'I didn't know what it was in the beginning,'" said Miss Marple. Hale looked at her sharply. "Where did you hear that?" "Mrs. Fellows. She overheard a conversation between them 3 weeks ago." She paused. "I told you about Mrs. Fellows." "You told me about the conversation, not that specific detail." He made a note. "We'll need a full statement from her." "She will give one willingly, I think. She has been troubled by it." He left at 11:30, and Miss Marple sat for a while in the quiet parlour with her knitting. She was thinking about the things that were finished and the things that were not. Harold Tice, arrested. Philip Rudd, dead. Eleanor Voss, dead these 10 years and more in Yorkshire, having never known whether her careful, brave arrangement had meant anything at all. Dr. Pemberton, who would face consequences of his own, professional ones, possibly legal ones, for what he had done and what he had permitted. She did not know what those consequences would be. She thought he was a man who would face them now that the long discipline of silence was broken. People were sometimes better, when it came to it, than the accommodations they had made suggested. Agnes Cartwright, who had noticed for 8 or 9 years and had spoken up when it mattered. Mrs. Fellows, who had heard a conversation through thin floorboards and had not known what to do with it until someone gave her the opportunity to do the right thing. The village, which would be altered by this and would take time to understand how. These were not tidy endings. Miss Marple had long ago stopped expecting tidy endings. Real things did not end tidily. They trailed off into consequences and adjustments, and the long, slow work of people putting themselves back together after the structures they had lived inside were found to be rotten. What there was, instead of tidiness, was truth. The portrait would be uncovered. Eleanor Voss's face would be seen. The document she had held for 20 years in a painted hand would be read by people who could act on it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. She went to the manor on Thursday afternoon. She had not planned to. She had been walking. The thin sunshine had persisted, and her doctor in St. Mary Mead had said that walking was beneficial. And she had found on the whole that he was right, though she had never told him so since it would only encourage him. And her walk had taken her, without any particular conscious intention, to the manor gates. Mr. Granville let her in. He led her to the great hall without being asked, which told her that he had thought about this and decided it was the right thing. He was that kind of man. The scene had been cleared. The police barriers were gone. In their place near the east wall, a careful arrangement of lights and equipment had been set up by the conservator from London. A composed woman in her 40s named Dr. Marsh, who looked up briefly when Miss Marple entered and then returned to her work with the focused attention of someone who is doing something precise and important. The portrait had been substantially uncovered. Not completely, that would take more days yet, but enough. The hunting portrait of the 3rd Baron Haverley had been carefully, expertly lifted away in sections, and beneath it, in the warm, clear colours of a skilled painter working at the height of his powers, Eleanor Voss looked out at the great hall of Chipping Haverley Manor. She was younger than Miss Marple had imagined, perhaps 30, dark-haired, with a direct, steady gaze that the painter had caught with evident sympathy and considerable skill. She was dressed simply, without the formality of a society portrait, and in her right hand, held slightly forward, held with a deliberateness that the painter had made no attempt to disguise. As though it were the entire point, which it was. She held a letter, several pages, folded once, and on the uppermost page, clearly legible even across the room, a date, 1930, and at the top, the name of a firm, Tice and Associates, Solicitors. Miss Marple stood and looked at her for a long time. Eleanor Voss looked steadily back. She said goodbye to Mrs. Atwood on Friday morning. Her fortnight was technically up, and besides, she was genuinely tired now in the way that she recognized. The bone-deep fatigue that came after something large had been completed, the kind that sleep alone did not entirely address. She needed her own chair and her own garden, and the particular quality of familiar silence that St. Mary Mead offered, with its own complicated, layered, endlessly human life going on all around her. Mrs. Atwood was sorry to see her go and said so at some length. Miss Marple thanked her for her hospitality, which had been genuine and warm, and accepted the tin of homemade biscuits pressed upon her for the journey, and allowed herself to be helped into the taxi with slightly less resistance than she sometimes offered. At the station, as waiting for the 10:45 to Oxford, she sat on the bench on the platform with her bag and her knitting and her tin of biscuits, and she thought about paintings, about the way a painting preserves a moment, holds it perfectly, holds a face and a gesture, and a specific quality of light from a specific day that is otherwise gone entirely. About the way things hidden beneath surfaces do not cease to exist simply because they cannot be seen. About the patience required to wait and the courage required to arrange things so that the waiting might eventually end in the right way. Eleanor Voss had been patient for 20 years in the only way available to her. Miss Marple thought she deserved to be seen. The 10:45 arrived 6 minutes late, breathing steam onto the cold platform. Miss Marple gathered her things. Accepted the assistance of a young porter who appeared at her elbow with touching promptness and climbed aboard. She found her seat, settled herself, placed her bag in the overhead rack, and took out her knitting. The train moved. The village fell away behind it, the Norman church, the high street, the manor on its hill. The October countryside opened out, brown and gold and grey, very flat and very quiet under the pale sky. Miss Marple knitted 3 rows without dropping a single stitch, which she considered, on the whole, a satisfactory end to the business.